Good afternoon, live from Toronto on the GBCam network. Welcome to the Chat Up Show, the show where we catch you up with a chat up of our weekly headlines. I'm your host, Elizabeth Aloidi, and I hope that you are ready to chat it up with me today. Now, as always, you know you can keep up with the GBCam network in various ways. You can listen and watch live 24/7 at www.gbkm.fm or www.gbkm.tv, where you can also catch up on any past shows you may have missed. You can check out our upcoming show schedule, learn a little bit more about our on-air personalities, check out our breaking news tab as well for news that spans across the globe, and you can like, share, comment, subscribe, all of that good stuff. You can watch us live on Facebook at GBCam Network and YouTube at GBCam Network. You can also follow us on Instagram and Twitter at GBKM Network. Yes, you may have noticed we've changed our handles just for a little more ease to keep up with us here on the GBKM Network. See what I did there? You can also download our free app to keep up with us, where you get live notifications as soon as we go live every time, so you never worry about missing a show. And in case you do miss a show, do not worry, because we have all of the same features available on our website on our app. Now, the app is free to download for all iOS and Android devices. So go on ahead and download that app so you can continue to keep up with us and watch all of your favorite shows, keep up with all the important news that's going on around the world. Now, today we are joined by two very special guests, but before we get into that, as we know, Ontario is still under, or yet again, under another state of emergency and lockdown, and there are a few more lockdown restrictions put in place. But vaccine rollout continues across the province, with more pop-up vaccination centers happening in hotspot communities. We actually went last week to one that was happening in the Jane and Finch area to check out what was going on there. But for those watching at home waiting to see when they will be able to go get vaccinated, make sure you stay updated, and we'll keep you updated, finding out which postal codes will be having these pop-up vaccinations available for those who are 18 years old and over. And with that, Ontario has also released the province's budget for 2021-2022, which included budgets to improve vaccination rollout, expanding testing, expanding long-term care spaces, more childcare options, and funding for small businesses. Now, to discuss this, as I mentioned before, I will be joined with Deputy Leader of the Ontario New Democratic Party and MPP, or now officially Dr. Sarah Singh. Welcome to the show, Dr. Singh.
Thank you so much for having me on today, Elizabeth. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Of course, me too. And we're also joined by GBKM's political analyst, Romaine Redman. Welcome to the show, Redman.
I was Elizabeth. Thank you so much for having me on today. Looking forward to the discussion as well as the MPP say.
Yes, great stuff. Now, we're going to dive into the budget. Just let's start there right now. Now, what were your initial thoughts about this new budget, Sarah?
You know, I think with the budget, we were very hopeful that we would see, the investments that we needed to protect our community, real direct supports for businesses, for example, increased vaccination capacity for hotspot communities, paid sick days, for example, was another measure that I think we were all hoping for in the spring budget, but we simply didn't see that. So I think that for many people, there were a lot of disappointments around the release of the budget. Many people were hopeful that there was going to be relief, some discussion or impacts around, post-COVID economic recovery. We didn't see that in this budget. And so I think it really falls short of what we needed to see for our communities.
Mm-hmm. And Romaine, from your understanding as well, just bouncing off what Sarah said as well, that, we didn't see a lot of funding available for those who have been hard hit, especially with the paid sick leave, which has been a hot button issue for a very long time now. What were your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. What I was essentially looking for in this budget is a recovery plan, right? And a recovery plan and complementary spending to help us not only secure our economy, but also secure the people in that economy who is driving that economy, right? So I was looking for spending in regards to the rollout of the vaccine. I'm looking for capacity and infrastructure building, and not just infrastructure in the traditional sense of
Mm-hmm.
understanding infrastructure, highways, and all that stuff, but in people that I consider to be a part of, integral part of the infrastructure, and the spending to that extent did not match up to what I was looking
Yeah.
for.
Yeah. As you said, that's a sentiment a lot of people shared as well. What was in this budget wasn't what we felt. It wasn't enough, almost, it seems, to really deal with what we've been having to deal with during this whole pandemic. We're still in the thick of it. And the budget did mention spending for vaccine rollouts, hospital services, expanding testing and long-term care spaces, hard hit during this pandemic. But would you say that this is not enough to reduce the strain, especially on our healthcare sector? Sarah?
Absolutely. I would say that it wasn't even a drop in the bucket compared to what we needed to see. And, investments in long-term care are always welcome. I think, what we want to see happening in long-term care is also, not only investments in long-term care, but for example, in home care and community-based care. And not even a single dollar allocated towards home care or community-based care services.
Mm-hmm.
And those organizations really are fundamental with respect to reducing the strain on, for example, our hospital or long-term care system. And so, when you look at the budget, where we could have been proactively investing in communities, just as Mr. Redmond indicates, really investing in people to help us recover, the budget doesn't do that. The budget also didn't help shore up, for example, staffing shortages in long-term care. Really falls short of making sure that there was, for example, a permanent pay increase for PSWs who have been at the forefront of this battle against COVID-19 in our long-term care system. Very little for them. A permanent pay increase is what we wanted to see. They are only getting a temporary pay bump. So when you think of what could have been invested in through this budget, it really didn't, go far enough to really help address the systemic issues. Today, as we learned, the Auditor General's report has also been released, value for money audit with respect to one. Last week we saw the Retirement Homes Regulatory Authority, but this week we learn about the government's COVID-19 response in our long-term care home. And knowing what was in this report and many of the sort of crises that we saw throughout long-term care, this budget didn't address any of those concerns or to help at least quell the fears that people have with respect to what's happening in our long-term care homes at the moment.
Yeah. Bring up the point that you mentioned about how there's not as much investment in people and staffing, especially, which is a point that the Nurses Association has also brought up, that there wasn't enough funding allocated towards actually staffing understaffed care, even the healthcare sector in general. And now we're seeing the province asking, the U.S. and the Philippines to essentially send volunteer doctors to come and help ease that strain. Do you think that is a step in the right direction, or it's a little too late now?
I think when we look at how other governments have responded to COVID-19 and addressed their staffing shortages, look at Quebec and what they were able to do over the summer, recruiting over 7,000 PSWs to their province. This government had all summer, nearly a year now, for what they knew was an impending third wave. This is no surprise to anyone. So I think, these last minute ditch efforts to sort of, call on others to come and clean up the mess that's been created here in Ontario is really unfortunate. You can also note that just recently the government refused the assistance of the Red Cross. So it doesn't quite make sense what the government is doing in terms of its pandemic preparedness, and then also taking action throughout the course of the pandemic. It's all a little too late, and we find them just sort of grasping at straws now to try to just, make sure that people have supports when, again, had they prepared appropriately, had they planned, had they actually made the investments that we needed them to make at the start of this pandemic when they received money from the federal government, we may not find ourselves in the situation that we do currently. So I think, right now what they're trying to do is just try to and put a Band-Aid on something that really, required and a lot of support and investments from the beginning.
I would like to add to the catch-up by MPP Singh, because it's not even catch-up in the general sense that we're catching up to make things better, but it's more like catching up to save face a little bit, because we still look at how much is being invested, and a lot of that will have to be supplemented by the federal government through their allocations in the 2021 budget. When we look even at the efforts right now, how do you refuse the Red Cross when they save us during the last outbreak, right? So it's not catch up in the general sense as you're trying to catch up to make it better, but trying to catch up to just save face a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Now, another thing that a lot of folks have had an issue with is the vaccination rollout. The government has said that, the Ford government has said that they are planning to add more funding towards that plan that they have in place, to go by age, but then now also having more pop-up vaccination centers. And just regarding these pop-up vaccination centers, do you believe, I'm going to start with Romain first, and then we're going to go on to Sarah. Do you believe that this should have been something that had started from the beginning instead of going age to age? Or would you say that, going through the different age demographics was probably the best option?
What I would say is that the third lockdown came multitude of opportunities for the government to exploit, right? We heard in the first wave, second wave, where the outbreaks were, where the heavy hit communities, the postal codes, and those are communities that are, of course, servicing of the sectors which are not jobs that can be done from home. We're talking about those logistic facilities in terms of getting food out to the population, getting supplies out to supermarkets. So at the top of the agenda should have been pop-up centers in and around those areas. When we talk about getting them in pharmacies, of course, but the opportunity here was to really target those hotspot places, especially those plants where the outbreaks are abundant, and really stem the effect from there. Because even if we look out where in communities and regions right now in Kitchener, where we don't have that tight and that concentrated outbreak kind of situation happening, had it been that the focus was placed on the Peel region, on the Toronto region, on in and around the GTHA in terms of getting those vaccines in. We heard the 25% top up, 25% top up to these communities. When these are the communities that are hard hit, there should have been greater focus placed on that and vaccines in, and not wait rather for those vaccines to be sitting there on refrigerators all around the province, but get those out as soon as we got them in from the federal government.
And what do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, no, I think that's been one of the sort of biggest failures of this government has been with the vaccine rollout. I hesitate to even call it a plan at this point because it's clear that there really wasn't much planning put into place here. I'm not a public health expert, so it's hard for me to say whether things should have been done via age or not. But I think to Romain's point, when we very clearly know where the hotspots are, the data was very clear. Those resources should have been allocated to those communities. For example, I'm a member that represents, Brampton Centre and part of the Peel region, and our community has been devastated by COVID-19, with the majority of those outbreaks happening in our workplaces. These are essential workers. Nearly 53% of our workforce in Peel are essential workers that do not have an option to stay home. And when you look at the rollout of the vaccine distribution here, it's not equitable. We were left out of, for example, the first round of the pilot program for pharmacies. It's baffling, I think, to everyone with respect to why we wouldn't have been included, why not a single pharmacy in Peel was included in that pilot program. Meanwhile, you look at a community like Kingston, who has 26 pharmacies, for example, providing vaccines to their population, and they're not in outbreak the way that we are in Peel. And yet we still haven't even even received our fair share of vaccines in terms of the distribution. Mr. Redmond points to the 25%. The science table actually recommends that 50% of those vaccines should be coming to those hotspot communities. 25% is half of that. So we're still not even at what science tables are recommending that we do, the experts are recommending that we do in terms of vaccine allocation. And even with the mobile pop-up clinics, I mean, they've been announced, but in Peel, we still don't have a mobile pop-up clinic. We have one that is outside of our community, and only certain postal codes will qualify for that. So it's just so much chaos and confusion for people. It's just so much inequity in the distribution and the approach to helping us fight COVID-19. It's just extremely disappointing to know that, essential workers, for example, as you mentioned, you were out in the Jane and Finch community, folks are lining up for hours in the cold to get a vaccine. And you look at other communities that have increased access, these folks, affluent communities within 5 to 10 minutes able to book a vaccine, get their vaccine the same day. Meanwhile, in communities where we have highly racialized populations of essential workers, these folks are forced to take time off work, line up for hours to get access. It's just not fair. It's really poorly thought out, and it's just not equitable.
Yeah. And even speaking of taking time off work, a lot of the time it's not even paid time off work. And that also brings us to the paid sick leave bill that, the NDP has been proposing since essentially February, and it's been voted no for about 25 times now. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that? What are your feelings, Sarah?
Yeah, my feelings, I think I have to censor how I really feel about what the government is doing, but it's extremely, extremely disappointing to know that there are proposals on the table, and that at every opportunity to help support providing paid sick leave to Ontarians, the government has voted against that. I think that what we have seen from medical experts, from the science table, even from mayors, big city mayors, from the start of the second wave, they were all very clear that we needed to have paid sick days implemented in the province of Ontario to help stop the spread of COVID-19. Here we are in the midst of a third wave, and the government is still choosing not to act. They're playing politics with people's lives. It's been very clear with the third wave that it's not just elderly people that are getting sick. It is actually our younger, essential workers who are ending up in the ICU. Recently, we're learning that many of them aren't even able to make it to our hospitals, and they're passing away at home. And just recently, 18-year-old daughter of an essential worker, Emily, unfortunately lost her life tragically due to COVID-19. You think of what paid sick days would have maybe prevented, how many deaths could have been prevented in our communities had workers simply had the option to stay home if they are sick. Again, it points to the sort of inequity in the response, and really understanding what working class people are experiencing today, and their reality. For many people living paycheck to paycheck, staying home is not an option because they can't afford to miss a day's work. And, as we were just discussing, even to get the vaccine, that's why New Democrats are fighting that is paid time off as well, so that they aren't, again, making a choice between, do I get a vaccine? Do I miss a day of work? We have to support workers through this, especially our essential workers, because they are the ones that are keeping our economy moving. They're making sure supply chains aren't interrupted, and they're also making sure that other people can stay home, that we get our groceries in our grocery stores, our Amazon delivery packages are arriving. That's because of essential workers in communities like Peel that have been forced to go into work. And they haven't been protected by the government. And so it's extremely disappointing to know that they refuse. And I think that's the thing I really want to underline, is that they refuse to provide the supports that workers need to stay safe and stay protected.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth, I want to just tag on to that too, because I think the rejection of the paid sick day, well, to me, it wasn't surprising, it wasn't shocking. As a matter of fact, it feeds right into the ethos of the Ford government. I mean, they came in literally erasing the win 10 and put the paid 2 sick days for companies. They came in on a campaign to eliminate measures like these to help the forecast of Ontarians who are working those minimum wage jobs, the ones who have to do two, 3 jobs. And sometimes the reality, even before COVID, is that they were getting burnt out, right?
Yeah.
They were getting extremely tired and benefiting from, that extra 2 days. It was only two then, right? 2 paid days is significant to helping them regenerate
Yeah.
for the workforce. And then we go into this unprecedented event like COVID
Mm-hmm.
19, where more and more essential workers are being pushed to the limit. They are being drained of their energy. They are being worked overtime just to keep our economy afloat and just to keep our economy going. And yet the government has essentially
Mm-hmm.
said no to that again. We look again at how it contradicts the platform that they ran on, where it is to protect jobs, secure jobs, but secure what kind of jobs and secure whose jobs and secure which part of the economy, right? It begs to ask a question about who really benefits when the government we will not give those foot soldiers, I love to call them our foot soldiers because they're the ones doing the hard work, uh, uh, getting the relief and the necessary support that they need. And we
Yeah.
talk about going to get the vaccine, which is integral in the fight, and we won't even give them 1 day pay time off for that. So, you know what it comes back to? It comes back to a trail of actions that we've seen on the Ford government and part of the Ford administration, where it's just all around questionable. And I'll just start with questionable decision making.
And it's an interesting point you bring up is that a lot of what we're seeing is before even the pandemic, there was a on these, workers and even industries. And now even more of a strain and still seeing the lack of support from the government and essentially blaming these people who do have no other option than to go into work because they can't work from home. Their job relies on face-to-face contact with other people. They shouldn't be the ones getting the brunt of the blame because there's no support there to help them, take time off work if they are feeling sick and ensuring that, their bills will still be paid if they do take that time off work, ensuring that they won't lose their job because they take time off work if they're feeling sick. Now we're going to
Absolutely.
Oh, go ahead,
Go
Romain.
ahead. My bad.
No worries. Okay, well, we're actually going to take a quick break, but stay tuned when we're continue discussing the Ontario budget with MPP Sarah Singh and Romain Redman, and also lockdown restrictions that had a few people, in a frenzy. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
This is not your regular show. It is an interactive section powered by the masses.
You go Nigeria, you wake up, you go come. I just said now, I don't go Nigeria.
Where we discuss issues that cut across politics, security, health, current affairs, governance, and so much more, with slices of humor to keep you entertained and thrilled. We are the GPKM Street Talk Team.
Welcome back to the Chat Up Show. I'm your host, Elizabeth Aloyde, and today we're discussing the Ontario third wave of in this pandemic, but also the Ontario budget for 2021. And we're joined by Romain Redman and Deputy Leader of the Ontario NDP, Sarah Singh. Now, before we went on the break, we were talking about how those in the essential workers aren't receiving enough support to really take care of themselves, take care of their health, to ensure that we stop the spread of COVID-19 in our province, and especially in the hotspot areas of our province. But now we're seeing more people advocating for paid sick leave. But Sarah, how would you suggest Ontarians advocate for themselves? We already have leaders on the floor advocating for us, but how can we as people really take it upon ourselves to speak up and say what we need from our government?
No, thanks so much, Elizabeth, for that question. I think it's a really important one. When you think of what citizens can do and the power that they have, it really can put a lot lot of pressure on the government. Just recently we saw the government sort of backtrack really quickly around playgrounds and keeping them open, for example, because of the outcry from community members and the pressure that put on the government to reopen those playgrounds. So with respect to paid sick days, I think we need to keep that pressure up. People need to get just as angry as they did about playgrounds being shut down about paid sick days. And so I encourage people to reach out to their MPPs, to email, to call, and to do that relentlessly until this government does what it needs to for people. Because clearly they do listen when the pressure is applied to them. Playgrounds is one example. We saw this with dance studios earlier in the pandemic as well, that when certain groups were loud and very effective with their mobilization and pressure that they applied on the government reacted to that. So I want to encourage everybody watching and everybody listening today to email your MPP, especially if they're a conservative MPP, because as New Democrats, we have certainly been echoing the call for paid sick days, but I encourage you to reach out to your conservative members and let them know that this is something that they want to see happen, and that if they don't move forward with this, there are going to be consequences at the ballot box come 2022 for their inaction.
Mm-hmm. Romain, any thoughts?
Well, I have to say the same thing, because the thing is, we are the most powerful part of the political systems. We elect our representatives, and one of the things that I've always called for over the years, whether it's through youth advocacy or any form of advocacy that I've done, is to get your voice heard through whichever channels, and through those important channels especially, which the key one is your vote, right? So you have to send a solid message to the government to say that if you don't do what is necessary to help us, then the consequence of that inaction is as follows, and that is you losing whether the majority that you have, losing government or replacing government, so to speak, effectively, right? So I think us as people, we ought to be united in our call to the government. And let me just put this out there, because anyone who leads, and especially in this time, I do have to send out a great level of respect for taking on that leadership role. That's one. But two is actually listening to the people who elected you to office. And sometimes, even when your base is saying something different, there's a huge majority which you have to listen to. The provincial government wasn't elected with 50% of the vote in the province or over. The federal government was not elected with 50% of the people speaking. So there's still a huge majority of people out there whose voice needs to be heard. And you know what? We're past the era of concessions. We have to look at the humanity of making decisions, right? We have to look at the people behind them and not just the economic outcome, even though I stand firm on the economic outcomes. But what we ought to realize is that targeted and effective financing and support for people will give us the economic outcome that we desire.
I mean, I
And
hear
if I
you.
could just add to that, I think actually, sorry, not to interrupt, Elizabeth, but just to piggyback off that too, when you think of the consequences of this and the inaction around paid sick days, it costs us more to put people in ICUs than it does to provide them the paid sick leave that they need to stay home. And so there are serious economic consequences to not implementing paid sick days, and it's putting a strain on our healthcare resources, which are already limited. So, I totally agree with you, Mr. Redmond, that that argument needs the forefront right now, because not only is this costing us lives, it is costing the government more to ship people around the province into different ICUs through Air Orange than to actually provide paid sick days. So it just doesn't make sense right now with respect to why they wouldn't want to implement a measure, not only that would save lives, but would actually save the system millions of dollars as well.
Yeah, those are especially when we consider just how much money is going into trying to keep things afloat, as opposed to helping allocate funds for those who are in desperate need of the resources and the support. And some of those people are small business owners as well, who have taken a major hit during this pandemic with lockdown restrictions. And the Ford government has actually created the Small Business Support Grant in January 2021, which provides a minimum of $10,000 and a maximum of $20,000 to help eligible small businesses with support. And so far, they know that approximately, as of mid-March, 120,000 small businesses will benefit from $1.7 billion in relief through this grant. Now, this sounds like something that would, help small businesses. We've seen restaurant owners even threatening to send their invoices to the Ford government saying, like, you have to pay us because every time you say we're going to open and then you take it back and you put us back in lockdown, what we've paid to, prepare for the reopening now is going down the drain, and we're losing money because of the inconsistencies in these restrictions. So what are your thoughts on this grant and this extra support or added support for small businesses, Sarah?
Yeah, no, I think last night I actually held a small business forum with some small business owners in Brampton, and what we've been hearing from many of them is that the supports that the government are providing are simply not enough, and many of them don't actually even qualify for the small business grant. And so that is putting them in a very challenging position, because it's not just their business that is suffering, it's also, as a small business owner, their livelihood that is being taken away. And so not only are they dealing with the loss of their business, they're now worried about how they're going to pay for their mortgage, for example, or auto insurance rates. And so, the small business grant has a number of barriers that are in place for these small businesses, and it really isn't addressing the root of the problem. Many of these businesses have lost tremendous amounts of revenue throughout the pandemic, and the grant doesn't help them offset that loss of revenue either. It doesn't also help them with some of the fixed costs that they might have, hydro, for example, insurance costs that they might be facing. So it simply doesn't go far enough. And we're hearing from many businesses that they've applied and they actually haven't even received a response with respect to their application. So it's just another announcement by the government without actually putting in place the processes that are needed to help support those businesses. It's also not going to help a business that's already been forced to close their doors and have been forced to shut down because they've lost so much revenue. So when we think of the supports that are needed, we think of a post COVID economic recovery. This grant really doesn't do much for these folks. And as you point out, Elizabeth, the sort of mixed messaging around each of these shutdowns, lockdowns, restrictions that are put in place. 1 minute it's like, okay, we're opening the patios, we're opening up, you're ready for business, and then businesses made those investments, thousands of dollars on getting ready. And then, a few hours later, they find out they now have to shut everything down, and there's no way to be compensated for the investments that they've made. And so it's really disappointing. I mean, this is a government that's supposed to understand the needs of businesses, and they very clearly have demonstrated that they just don't get it. Just uneven application as well. Stores being allowed to stay open while small businesses have been forced to shut their doors. Makes sense, and the supports were not there to help those businesses get through every single one of the waves that we've experienced here.
Yeah.
I wanted to piggyback on that too, because it was shocking to me, to be honest, to see that, activist groups, NDP, the Liberals had to be on the government about small business support. It's one of the most ironic things ever to probably come out of their decision-making process, because I'm like, the campaign strategy for the Conservatives were that we are for small businesses, we are for the suburban small shops, we are for those persons who are just trying, put it in conservative terms, pull yourself up by your shoestrings. And then we had to wait not for the summer, not for the fall, but for the new year for that fund to be put in place, while all this time it was being deflected to the federal government. And I also want to expound on that point too, because it is a recurring theme for this administration in terms of kicking everything to the federal government. And these are supports that can be provided by the province that are many of the times within the provincial jurisdiction. We saw it when fall came. It was the federal government. Over 90% of what was spent for school reopening was from the federal government. We saw it with the rent subsidies. We saw it with small business grants. It was the federal government who first came out at the onset of Q2, quarter two, to say we are going to be providing these supports for economy because we believe in a strong recovery, and these are the mechanisms to get us there. All while we had a provincial government who essentially dragged their feet and wait for the federal government to continue spending, 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 and depending on the federal government while seeking autonomy here in the province. And it was just conflicting to see that going on. But then it really goes back to the poor decision making that is coming out of the administration in terms of 8 hours in a meeting, and we get what? They're going to be stopping people ranting. That is beyond poor decision making. That was something that was a major flaw, and I actually don't think proper consultation was done in that regard. Because had it been that proper consultations was done to arrive at that decision, that would not have been one of the decisions made. And I don't know if it's true that they're not listening to the experts, but in that regard, I must say it is pointing more towards that direction than away from.
Yeah. Now, I actually want to bring up a point that Sarah had mentioned, is that, small businesses had to open, but big box stores were still allowed to function, even though, of course, capacity was reduced. But even then, like when I go grocery shopping, I know no one's really checking if I'm socially distancing properly or following the arrows properly. And a lot of people felt that the government wasn't focusing on what was really important and giving support to what was really important, small businesses, because the average small business probably doesn't have more capacity than maybe maximum the 10 people that are allowed indoors, as opposed to when you go to these big box stores, you have so many people in there, and not everyone is socially distancing as much as they probably should be, and the essential workers are either understaffed or they're trying to focus on keeping everyone at bay outside of the store, ensuring that people are they're keeping within the capacity limits as well. And now we have the government saying that maybe the best restriction for these big box stores is to close off certain aisles. And that was the next best solution to help stop the spread in these spaces. Romain, I'm going to start with you. What were your thoughts when you heard this was part of the new lockdown restrictions?
Big box store has, been. I'm trying to put this into. Big box stores has been on the side of the government. Let's say that has been on the side of the government in terms of, they've been essentially given a free market to reign. And I've been in these big box stores because that's all the place you can go. And we see the lax, rules being put in place in terms of they're not effectively managing crowd, flow of the crowd that come in. They're not effectively doing those cleanings as regularly as possible, and they're not following the restrictions as we hope that they would. But then again, I start thinking back as to, having the corner shops and all those stores closed. I've been in corner shops, right? It's what, five, maybe you see 10 people in the store at once. And if we're going to close those guys, right, why is it that we can't have some kind of better mechanism if we want to keep some sort of services open, especially when it comes to the essential? Why is it that we can't have a better system in place to monitor these stores and not just give them this free reign for congregation and then give them a slap on the wrist every time we hear that something is happening or there's a case linked to something to a store, right? So I think what needed to be done in that regard was for there to be strict enforcement and an oversight of how these stores will operate under the restrictions and to ensure that they keep within those guidelines. When we see the escalating case, we just shot up 2 weeks ago to some 4,000 cases per day, right? It warrants the argument that should we have locked down completely for 2 weeks, right? It warrants that kind of argument if we absolutely need to go into a total shutdown. We look at the case of New Zealand and everyone rails at how great Jacinda is and how the Prime Minister handled the case. But what they're missing out is it's not just her greatness, but the plans and how she stuck with all the advice that she was being given by the experts, by the professionals, by the people who actually know how to deploy these kind of like logistical avenues, right? She listened and she took the advice and she was decisive. And when we say decisive, we don't mean making concessions for persons who stand to. It was decisive on part of the people. We're trying to save lives. We saw them. She closed off the north from the south. She closed off the mid from the south because of containment efforts, and we fail on each step to do that, right? Even right now with the variants that are coming in, we saw in back in December of last year when the UK variant was announced how decisive the federal government was in that regard. And now it is with the Indian case and how we had to wait for a couple of days, probably a couple of weeks, depending on how you're tracking, for there for a decision to be made, right? And it's not a case of we're excluding people from coming in, but we're securing the people that we have inside it because we have one, the original form of the disease, the virus that we have not fully contained as yet, and there is no, we don't see the light of at the end of the tunnel as yet.
Now, you brought up New Zealand, which, has become like a benchmark for a lot of governments and countries across the globe as to how to deal with this pandemic. And Romain, you mentioned how if we had just gone on a strict lockdown, hopefully that will help with the situation. But do you think it's maybe a little too late now for that to have as much of an effect compared to if we had done that from the beginning? I'm going to pose this question to MVP Sarah Singh.
Okay, go
No,
ahead.
thank you.
I was going to add to that, but go ahead.
Thank you.
After.
Absolutely, certainly. I think Redmond, raises a really important point when you look at sort of the decisiveness and the implementation of policy measures that were effective. This government isn't listening to what the experts have been calling for, and that's why we find ourselves in the situation that we do. The modeling that predicted, the third wave and the record-breaking cases, this was released early February. And at that time, we heard the government loosening restrictions and, advocating that, for example, patios be open and other measures be loosened, when at a time we probably needed to be going in the opposite direction and tightening those restrictions and preventing mobility. The government chose not to do that. So it really makes you question, what's driving the decision-making process and really who has the ear of the government. It's deeply, deeply troubling that, experts and evidence and modeling has been clear with respect to what we should be doing, but the government simply hasn't been taking that advice. We have also learned that, it is political insiders that have helped drive some of the decision-making processes, not public health experts. And that, I think, is why we find ourselves in such a catastrophic third wave. Again, had the measures that needed to be implemented been implemented, paid sick days, increased vaccinations, perhaps smaller classrooms, for example, class sizes being capped, we wouldn't see the outbreaks in some of those settings that we did. But those policy measures were not implemented and the advice was ignored. And that's why we find ourselves in the situation that we do. And it really didn't have to be this way.
Absolutely. And just to add to that question too, I really do think that we are beyond the point where a complete shutdown would be like the best right now, because we know people are becoming very, very frustrated with these lockdowns, right? And to instill a very strict and tight lockdowns right now will have a strong opposition from the people. I mean, a lot of us who are even in agreement with these lockdowns, we are coming to the end of our wits because of this recurring kind of like situation. What I think was necessary at the time when it was first being said was on the onset, before we got to wave 2, right? When people were saying lock it down tight, when we didn't reach the point where it was community spread and household spread anymore, when it was still within certain areas and still within certain businesses and within certain individuals, and we could have gotten a grip on that. That is what New Zealand actually did. And I again go back to people referencing the New Zealand case when it is not being done here. Right? If anyone knows, and Sarah, you just completed your doctoral dissertation, to reference a case, to present you have to have similar markers and similar implementation strategies or something that you're taking to implement, and that is just not what we see happening.
That's some great points there. Now I want to pivot back to discussing the budget as well. Earlier this year, I actually spoke with you, Sarah, saying about affordable housing and the ONDP's plan for that in the future. And we know that homelessness is still a prevalent issue, especially here just in the GTA, in the Toronto area. And within this budget, a lot of critics have said that there wasn't enough discussion about how this government was planning to help alleviate that stress and that pressure on people. During this pandemic, a lot of public services have been closed. So areas that the homeless population would go to get support, relief, aid, even just stay indoors through the winter, have been closed to the public. And it seems that there's not a lot that government is doing, and there's not enough, I would say, people are feeling that the government is doing in regards to affordable housing funding and budget allocation. What are your thoughts on this particular budget this year in regards to that, Sarah?
Absolutely. I think, when we think of the housing crisis that we have here, it's been very disappointing to see the lack to address, for example, homelessness, or to help create affordable housing or even assisted living for seniors. None of these investments are in this budget. And I think now more than ever, we need to be investing in community. Bringing this sort of back to the lens of COVID, you look at communities throughout the GTA, many people are living in congregate living situations because housing is not affordable. So you have multi-generational families, many people living in, under-housed situations because they cannot afford anything other than the situation that they're in. And this has also contributed to the spread of COVID-19 in many of these examples. There could have been an investment, for example, in isolation centers to help create spaces for people to safely isolate who are living in a congregate living setting. These investments simply weren't made. This is a government that looked to cutting from homelessness programs and investments to municipalities, because let's not forget that a lot of the housing responsibilities have been downloaded to municipalities who are already strained with respect to their budgets and very limited with their budgets in terms of making those investments. So, any investments that were given to municipalities throughout the pandemic weren't to help them make the investments that are needed. It was just to help them keep afloat. And so when you think of, again, a post-COVID economic recovery, housing is a perfect sector that we can be investing in to help spur jobs, but also create homes for people that they can afford. I think this was a really missed opportunity by this government to help not only address the housing crisis, but also create good paying jobs for people.
Absolutely, and it also goes back again, as I said, to get it back to the federal government, because the federal government did in fact outline their strategy when the last time there was a budget 2019 and also in the 2021 budget for housing. I mean, just last year, how much was given to the Rapid Housing Project, and we looked to the federal government to assist some of these municipalities, and the help just didn't come. So it goes back again to this whole situation of what is for the people, as reported by the Ford government. We have to be critical of that phrase. And you know what? He understands what it means, because he's clearly acting on an ethos that is in line with what we've seen him do since he has come in. It's just that probably some of us need some clarification as to what that is, right? Because we asked for housing, there is no funding. As a matter of fact, he decommissioned even disaggregating and collecting data about homelessness across the province in 2019. So again, it goes back to what does for the people mean really? Is it for some people? Is it for certain people? Is it for not this class of people? What does it really mean?
That's a very good point, and I think that's a question that's on a lot of people's mind. It's like, who are the people that you're serving? Is it those that are in a certain demographic, in a certain socioeconomic bracket? living in a certain area as well, or is it everybody across the board, regardless of race, gender, or socioeconomic standing? Now, I want to kind of pivot to lockdown measures that have been recently put in place and that were pushed back against. Sarah, you mentioned earlier that people push back against the closure of playgrounds, but a lot of people push back against the restriction that was initially put in place that would allow police officers to essentially stop and ask people on the streets where they were going, what they were doing, and whether it was for essential purposes. Now, I see Sarah shaking her head already. Well, let's start with you. What were your thoughts on this?
What a disappointment. I think it just, to bring back carding as a response to, your failed policy measures, I think really underscores just the lack of understanding from this government, lack of consultation, and lack of meaningful action, that we need. And it was very interesting to watch, the news conference on Friday and sort of this police state being announced. It created so much fear and anxiety for people, especially racialized communities, where we've already been disproportionately impacted by interactions with the police. To think that our essential workers could now be randomly stopped on their way to work just was really baffling to so many people. But it was really interesting to watch not only the community, push back against this measure, but police forces as well, one right after the other, indicating that they had not been consulted, they will not be implementing these measures. And, you can take that with a grain of salt, but it again shows you that there's just no consultation. There is no real effective I think analysis being done with respect to what we need. It's like they're just pulling ideas out of the air here at this point to say that we're doing something. What we needed to see that Friday was an announcement around paid sick days, which would have helped people stay home if they were sick. Instead, what the government thought was more appropriate was introducing a police state. And, they very quickly walked. But that was because I think, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, I think when you look at sort of, non-racialized, affluent communities speaking up against these policy measures, I think that's where we saw this retraction happen very quickly, because of course, people of color have been, and BIPOC communities have been saying this for some time, that we have these disproportionate impacts, with policing. I don't think it was necessarily our voices that they were listening to. I really think it was other voices and the police getting involved that really helped push this forward. But again, we do, and I'm continuing to hear stories from racialized community members who are still being stopped and being asked by, for example, the OPP, about their whereabouts and being asked to identify themselves. It's deeply, deeply concerning and troubling that this is the approach that the government chose to pursue when they could have implemented other policy measures. And, I'll just share as well, I'm a member of the Select Committee on Emergency Management Oversight. And a few sessions ago, in anticipation of some stricter measures, and what we knew was already happening in our community, interactions with police, I asked the Solicitor General if they would be collecting race-based data to highlight who was being asked to provide identification or justify their whereabouts. And the Solicitor General indicated that they wouldn't be doing that. And I think that's very, very concerning, because I think that the data would show us that it would be people of color who would be disproportionately impacted by these measures. So again, it just points to a lack of consultation, a lack of analysis, and really thinking about the outcomes of the measures that they're implementing. It's extremely disappointing, and that's why I just shake my head at it, because it really makes you wonder, who are they listening to? Where are they coming up with the policy measures that they're implementing? It's clear they're not really even consulting with the people that are going to be tasked with implementing the measures that they're imposing.
Yeah. Romain, anything to add?
I just have to say that was very, very, very poor decision making on the part of the Premier and his team. I mean, how could anyone who lives in 2021, especially in leadership, especially in government, make a decision of that nature? And I think it was especially important. I mean, before the community's voice, it was especially important for the police, who didn't necessarily was under the control of the provincial government to come out and say that we will not be
Yeah.
doing this because they know what the effects of carding were, as mentioned by MPP Singh. They know what those effects are. We know where we find more police officers, right? And what is going to result from that, right? So the police coming out to say, first and foremost, we will not be doing that was pivotal in getting the government to walk back in that. And we listened to Premier Ford make his press conference and even shed a little tears to emphasize his regret for this. But I mean, we're in wave three, and decision of such catastrophic proportion should not be we should not be seeing decisions made of that nature. At this point, what we should be doing is ironing out crinkles and kinks that were in previously set plans, right? That is where we are right now. It's like you doing anything, right? It's like drafting a bill right now. If you're in this third stage and you're still having to make major concessions, then something is wrong with everything that you're doing, right? If you're in the third stage and you're making severe decisions that have to be, reneged in one day, it is evident that something horribly wrong is going on within the camp, and we cannot have that as an effective step to fixing what is happening right now. We saw it in our neighbors across the border, the US, where they started off catastrophically, but has managed to somehow this virus. And that is what we were kind of looking for because we always poise ourselves as the more to the north. But we've lost that sense of morality because we can't even contain a virus which we were positioned. And I said we were positioned because on the onset of this pandemic, we were among some of the first nations in the world to do a lot of what we're seeing happening and taking the advice of what we've seen recommended by the World Health Organization, the World Bank. We even listened to the World Bank in terms of spending. Don't worry about the debt because right now we're staring down the barrel of a recession. So we have to try to pull ourselves out. And essentially, the province has ignored that, right? While we've seen the federal government done what they are supposed to do by increasing spending. As a matter of fact, the World Bank said 3% to help secure the economy, secure people's health. And we can argue that Ontario is in a position to be classified as a country, right? So even if we want to argue side of border, oh, we are within the Canadian Confederation, but it's still within our jurisdiction. We have enough power and autonomy to make decisions of that nature. And I tell you, our economy in the long run is going to have impacts from some of these decisions that we're taking. We're in a third wave. That alone sets us on a very poor track for recovery. But what I would say, though, I did find some comfort in what was offered in the budget around training and development of the workforce. Absolutely. Giving those support to businesses and to individuals to get themselves reskilled and ready for the job market is absolutely crucial. But then again, if you're not securing their health, they will not be there to, of course, make use of these investments.
Yeah. Yes. Now, the NDP leader did put out a statement saying that Premier Ford is essentially playing the blame game when putting these policies in place, putting the blame on the rest of us, essentially, that it's our fault that because we're not staying home as much as we probably should, including essential workers, and instead of focusing and implementing measures that would give more support to those who need it. For example, paid sick leave, more effective and efficient vaccine rollout to hotspots. But just thinking of the role that law enforcement was essentially supposed to play in this policy, do you think that there's any role law enforcement can play in trying to stop the spread of the virus, trying to stop people from moving around as much? I'm just trying to understand the line of thinking from this government, to put out a policy like this. Like, in your opinion, what kind of role can law enforcement play outside of handing out fines and arresting restaurant owners who aren't properly socially distancing and, keeping up with the measures in place?
What I would say in that regard is, the police force is the one who's supposed to, uphold the law, maintain order, and see to it that policies are executed, right? Good policies are executed. So yes, I do have a role to play. They can be that supportive mechanism in terms of getting that information out there, directing people on what not to do. Even at these big box stores, they can serve a purpose, right? Where it is not so much that aggressive uh, kind of like show of force, but more like a guidance and a help to these organizations, right? Because we do know what goes on, right? You have persons who refuse to wear masks going into these places, even though they're mandated. You have people who blatantly disobey the rules. We have persons who, for reasons beyond my comprehension, are out on the streets racing cars and doing drag in the middle of the street, drag racing in the middle of the streets. And that is the role that they ought to play. They are to be the ones who secure our provinces, ensure that the laws and the rules are being followed, but not in a way that targets individuals, belittles individuals, and of course bring unnecessary discomfort to the Ontario people.
Sarah, do you have anything to add?
No, I absolutely agree with Mr. Redmond. I think that there certainly is a role for law enforcement to help educate and to encourage people to follow the rules. But what we saw with the announcement that was made was broad sweeping powers that they didn't even ask for because they are going about carrying out their duties in our communities at the moment and trying to again address what are some real problems. We do know that people are gathering, that this is happening. And in those instances, the police have been called and they have been able to mitigate those issues. But what the announcement did was give them the power to randomly stop people on the street to and from perhaps their place of work. Also, I think empowered other people to engage with the police if they felt their neighbor, for example, wasn't following the rules. I think it just, again, it was not well thought out with respect to what the outcomes would be. And I think very quickly people started to realize that this type of a measure and this regulation would have unintended consequences that we just simply didn't need at that point in time. And the police were very clear. You cannot police your way out of this in people. It's disappointing that we haven't seen that from the government, but we're going to keep up the fight and keep pushing to make sure that Ontarians are protected as we navigate this pandemic together.
Great, thank you. And Romain, anything else to add?
Well, absolutely seconding MVP Singh's call. But what we must remember as people is that a huge part of this COVID-19 fight lies in our hands, right? Wearing our masks, getting the vaccines when they become available, social distance in many cases, and of course, trying to keep ourselves and our families safe. So even when the government doesn't do, there are still things that we can do. And when the government does not do what it is supposed to do, it's incumbent upon us to get on whichever platform is available to us and voice our concerns. If we have to send that email, absolutely. If we have to make that call, absolutely. If we see a new scheme calling for us to give an insight, definitely get that in. On Twitter is a vibrant community for echoing your thoughts and your opinions. Get on there and make them heard. I mean, we are going into the second, just over a year and a couple months going into this pandemic right now. And we know what the experts are saying, right? We know what the experts are saying. We know what is expected. So just do what we can to help this fight. And if we don't have to do certain things, just don't do it. If you don't have to go outside, don't go outside. If you don't have to go and visit that family member, we're all missing family. I haven't seen family in over a year, right? Because I'm playing my part, right? Just do what you can so that when the government fails to put necessary systems in place, or when anyone fails to put necessary systems in place, that it doesn't fall on us getting sick and even dying. Because at the end of the day, we're the ones who are the protector of our own health as much as we possibly can.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me today, MPP Sarah Singh and Romain Redmond. And with that, that concludes our Chat Up for today. Thank you so much for joining me on the Chat Up show today and for joining in the conversation as well. As always, you know you can keep up with the GBKM network in various ways. You can continue to listen and watch live 24/7 at www.gbkm.tv or www.gbkm.fm. You can follow us across social media platforms platforms on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter at GBKM Network. Remember, that's GBKM Network. You can also download our free app so you get notifications every time we go live to stay updated on what's going on here in Ontario and even just across the globe. You can also follow me, your host, on Instagram and Twitter at TIS_Liz_O. And with that, I will chat with you the same place next week. Chat with you then. Take care.
This is not your regular show. It is an interactive section powered by the masses.
You go come Nigeria, you wake up, you go come. Ask yourself now, I don't go Nigeria.
Where we discuss issues that cut across politics, security, health, current affairs, governance, and so much more. Slices of humor to keep you entertained and thrilled. We are the GBKM Street Talk Team.